Alex, let's start with the DMA, and then we can get into the specifics of the difficulties around Apple over the last week. The Digital Markets Act, what was it set out to accomplish? How was it brought into law? And what are the objectives this morning based on what you've heard?
So broadly speaking, it targets what it deems gatekeepers in the tech ecosystem, and there are a number of criteria which determine whether something is a gatekeeper. They're kind of engineered really to target the big tech companies we know about, and we include TikTok in that. It's things like market cap, perhaps more than $75 billion, the number of users they have in the European Union. All of these criteria that were laid out, about 3-4 of them, plus 8 different categories, are aimed at targeting these companies. Now, essentially, it was put together because it didn't seem as though the law was keeping pace with the technological landscape, that there were certain behaviors that the European Parliament, the European Union, didn't think were acceptable, and so they sort of reverse engineered the legislation in order to correct that. Now, that legislation came into act a little while ago. This is the first time we're really seeing, they've given them a little bit of time to, catch up with the law. Now they're starting to wield the stick and bring them into line on issues where they suspect they may not have fully adhered to the letter of the law.
So, Alex, in years gone by, we've heard plenty of complaints from the Europeans about US tech. And often where we end up further down the road is maybe a fine in line with something like 5 minutes revenue from some of these companies. Alex, is this going to be different? Do you sense this is different this time?
What we've seen in the past, is big fines, right? And that is not necessarily the behavioral solutions that really change a company's, as you would expect, behavior. Now, this looks as though it's really targeting the behaviors, and the scope of those fines is potentially meaningful. It's 10% of a company's revenue and can be repeated until they fall into line. It's different from what we've seen last week in the US, where the Justice Department looked at a range of things pertaining to Apple. Here, the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager, is being very targeted, it seems, on at least in this first sort of parry or first thrust into what they are targeting. And it's very discrete parts of those businesses which suggest they might have thought about it a little bit more carefully.
We already see Apple getting rid of the 30% commission it's imposed on developers. What can they do to make up some of these losses when they're facing things like they are in the EU?
Well, they've scrapped this 30%, but they haven't necessarily scrapped it entirely. They've just reduced it. And when we look at how much of Apple's total business that is, it isn't that meaningful. Of course, services overall have become a far larger part of Apple's revenue. But a lot of that is to do with things like the amount of money they get from Google in order to make it the preferred search engine. It's to do with the rise of Apple TV+. It's to do with Apple Music. It's not just the App Store. Now, when it comes to how they then offset some of that, well, there will be a bit of a decline. The real thing, as everybody's been talking about, is new product categories, right? And that is something they have been trying, not least in services, and of course with Vision Pro. This thing in and of itself is not a massive slice of Apple's revenue.
As John mentioned, and Alex, I think that it's important to double down on this idea that in the past we saw EU types of fines and probes into the big tech giants of the United States. Everyone just kind of shrugged and said it's going to be a rounding error. It's not going to be that substantial. How much is this time different just because, in particular for Apple, just because of everything that's happened, not just with the Department of Justice, but also given the overhang with China and some of the slowdown that we saw in sales there?
Yeah, I think you kind of point at just 2 or 3 things that are really making this perhaps a little bit different. Firstly, of course, that Apple is starting to stutter a little bit when it comes to growth. It is still managing to grow its bottom line, but when it comes to revenue, it seems to be shrinking a little bit. Now, that is something that is harder to fix if you then have the second thing that I'm going to get onto, which is this broader fear that if you are constantly in the crosshairs of antitrust, of regulators, then as a company, your culture, it can change a little bit and you start second-guessing yourself. Do we want to do this, or are we going to get ourselves in trouble? I don't want to put this in an email because maybe I'm going to be subpoenaed. This is the sort of thing that we saw at Microsoft 20, 25 years ago. It took them some time to recover from that. Of course, Microsoft did recover from that. They are now the biggest company in the world by market capitalization. But it did change the culture there in a way that has been well documented. That is now the big fear with Apple, whether it starts to chip away at their ability to come up with these new blockbuster products.
Just to put a bow on it, is this more of an Apple story and less of an all of the big tech story that they're being targeted right now by the EU simply because there is this feeling that they're going to be disproportionately affected with culture changes at a time where their business model is being fundamentally challenged in terms of its global presence?
I think the stakes for Apple right now feel a little bit higher. That doesn't mean that the Google and Meta or Alphabet and Meta aren't going to be targeted at all. There's also, she was talking about Amazon too. The thing you do have to remember, though, is that the European Commission only has so much capacity. You know, they don't have hundreds of people working on this stuff. They're relatively small teams, actually. So if Apple's the one gaining the headlines right now, and it's the one that she's spending the most time talking about, you could probably well expect it's where they're going to be spending a lot of their time and attention. That doesn't mean that the others won't come into the firing line at some stage a little bit further down the line.